Hey everyone, I wanted to first and foremost make sure that all of you have seen my announcement. Keep on your radar that things start happening pretty rapid fire here at the end of class. So this week in week 6 you have your second exam. Week 7 you have kind of a little respite for just 1 week, and then week 8 you're going into your final exam, so exam 3. So keep that on your radar. You may want to start working on reading ahead. If you were able to get I tried to post that announcement at the beginning of week 5 in hopes that some of you would be able to work ahead for this week. But if not, as soon as you finish your exam, try to work ahead in week 7 and see if you can get some of week 8 banged out before you're sitting in week 8 trying to write your exam. Hopefully that should help everyone, because the way they've structured this class does make it so right here in the last couple weeks you're really jamming through some stuff. So good luck with that. Please reach out to me if you need any help with anything. That in mind, I'm going to try to make sure we can really get through things a little bit more quickly this week for everyone. So, our 3 readings out of the philosophy text. You've got Richard Dawkins, famous scholar for being pro-science and anti-religion. He's a modern scientist. He's the one who kind of got famous for the notion of like religion creates this flock of dodos, and he's often cited when talking about religious terrorism. The reason why is because he's basically one of the very first people that makes the argument that religion leads to people being zealots, which means like overarchingly religious with nothing else in their life. So it leads to people being extremists, basically. I don't know if you guys caught it, but right in the title, you have a nod to Pali. Since you guys are so well read in all of the previous literature that many of these scholars are using, sometimes you'll catch those little fun nods to someone else, but this is why we have the blind watchmaker. So it's a nod to the watchmaker theory that we read of Pali's. He's writing this at a time when the world is feeling pretty hopeless. Many people are having major faith quakes because of the AIDS epidemic, and this is happening mostly in the Americas. It's sort of the first time that America is having a major faith quake, when, other countries in the rest of the world have sort of seen tragedy, seen hard things before, had to grapple with these ideas a lot earlier. This is sort of when America becomes disillusioned here in the 80s. And early 90s as well. And so in the beginning you'll see a lot of reference to that, how can we have AIDS, and how can religious people be claiming AIDS on their behalf, that it's only sinners getting this, and it's kind of the first real break in the Americas of religion and science, or religious people using religion for harmful means. He jumps off of that and starts to say that faith and religion, well, not really even religion, but blind faith is one of the great evils in the world because it leads to extremism. Faith, when not checked by any sort of evidence, is what causes people to kind of go off the deep end. That's the crux of his arguments. And he says that never happens in science because science is constantly being checked. So if you have a belief or a theory that is constantly being checked and rechecked, it doesn't tend to lend itself to extremism, whereas faith and religion doesn't have those checks and balances. So he says science has all of the virtues of religion because it's working on explaining things, it's being helpful, it's working on advancement, it's giving something people to believe in, but it doesn't have any of the vices. It has a check, it has a reason, it has many of the helpful aspects and none of the harmful aspects, basically. He talks about how not only are we faithfully religious people not bothered by the lack of evidence, but actually that it's their resounding rah, we don't need evidence, and they take, it's like not needing evidence is their pride and joy, I think is what he says. So that's an important point, is because that's where you start to see the rejection of scientific evidence, or the rejection of moral thought. He talks about culturally inflicting religion, which you guys will probably recognize because this gets used a lot when we start talking about freedom of religion and the school's arguments, like how is one religion being inflicted upon another? How is one religion like being oppressive to another? That's a very important place where this is often cited, especially when it comes to children, because he takes the time to single out children. He also puts forth, we're insignificant in the universe and we need to recognize that and take more of a role in that, take more of a role in the universe that's not thinking that we are the center of it. So that's another place where people often cite him. The thing that I really want you guys to pull out, and the thing that I put in my notes during this reading, is this idea of myth versus truth. And why I think this is important is because it's going to be the place in any of our conversations or any of your future conversations where things become a slippery slope. People tend to say, like, well, that's fine because they're just teaching myth. But that's actually a very disrespectful term when it comes to religion. You're thinking that, obviously, like, your religion is the only one that is religion, and others are just a myth. And I think that can lead us to kind of some problematic spaces. So I'm glad that, if nothing else out of this reading, we really get that idea. People talk about, like, oh, of course, like, my 4th graders learning Greek mythology. But we can't talk about religion in school because people think Greek mythology, like, they put it on this lower plane, even though if you think about where Greek mythology comes from and where Christianity comes from, these are two competing religions for years and years in antiquity. So little bit of an interesting point here, and definitely something to keep in mind. I think his major contribution to this class is sort of that notion. Okay, so then you get into Gould. He's modern. He is a science and religion guy. And his major contribution is that these two ideas and these two studies, they're totally different spheres, and that they don't overlap, that they butt up against each other, but they never... So if you think like a Venn diagram, you have the two circles. They're never overlapping. Although they butt, they never sit like that. He talks about creationism versus science as this sort of very, very, very American problem. He says, this isn't happening in other countries, and it hasn't happened in history. This is the first time that this is happening, is in the sort of like New America. So he's talking kind of about the 80s, about the late 70s, 80s, 90s. This is the first time where we start to see this major, major issue coming up. And one of the things that he supposes is why this is happening is he talks about how Baptists and some Protestants come up with this idea of it. The word is called inerrancy. And what that means is that there's no errors in the Bible and that it is divinely inspired completely and wholly. It's not a historical text, it's not a retelling, it's not written by men, but rather written by God. And this is sort of a new idea in Christianity. Christianity has existed for thousands of years without this happening. But for some reason, when we make the transition into the Americas, Christianity is looking for more validity in its holy book because all of the other holy books have this divinely inspired, especially Islam, so they're competing with Islam. And we just talked about Islam last week and how we believe the Islamic people believe that every word is divinely inspired. So when Christianity starts to compete with Islam, Christianity, especially Protestants, especially Baptists, adopt this notion of inerrancy. And it becomes really problematic because there are things that we can tell through science are problems, questions, issues. Even the fact that, we have there's certainly people who've spent their entire life offering explanations, but just even thinking about the formation of the canon, it was bishops that decided what goes in the Bible and what stays out of the Bible, and that creates the ideas Were some of the books that they left out of the Bible also inerrant? Was there a gospel that was divinely inspired, handwritten by God, that got left out? Was there something that maybe wasn't divinely inspired, but it really helped the bishop's cause, that was included? So once we get into inerrancy, basically Christianity gets itself in a very sticky situation. And that is what Gould is writing about. So he's talking about this American phenomenon, this Protestant phenomenon, and he's saying, always, and he's kind of reminding Christians, because he is a Christian, and he's reminding Christians, we haven't always read text this way. We've always read it as illuminating, we've always read it as important, we've always read it as influential, we've always read it as our history, as a retelling, as the people who were witnesses, witness testimony, but we've never really read it as inerrant, without error. So he says what we need to do is we need to remember that science is studying one thing, we're studying another, and we need for that to be okay. If science comes up with something, of course we'll find good ways to incorporate it in our faith, but it doesn't change our faith, because science isn't studying anything that our faith needs. So he talks about, basically, I think the most important quote from him is that science is studying how the heavens go, and religion deals with how to go to heaven. So that's sort of where he sees things going. So you have him making this idea of two separate spheres, and then Pope John Paul kind of takes his work. He's very well read on this, and he's talking about, I don't know if you guys went back through and sort of read the history, but he's writing in 2005, so very modern. And he was the Pope from 78 to 2005, so kind of saw this major faith quake happening in the Americas, definitely understands what's going on in the Americas, definitely is speaking on some level to the Americas and to England. But he's talking about Galileo, and what happened is that Galileo was the scientist from sort of right after medieval times, and was one of the first people to say, to sort of use science and make these outrageous claims that we know now to be true about whether the earth revolved around the sun or the sun revolved around the earth. And at the time, remember how we talked about previously when we were reading Hick, I believe is who we were reading that we were talking about? But there's countless of our authors that we've read where we talked about the fact that they have to write from sort of this hypothetical, well, it could be this, or they write with using someone else's name, or using, saying someone else said this, and here's what I think, because if you said anything sacrilegious, you could be jailed by the church, or you could be kicked out of a community. So, if you guys remember that, that's what basically happens to Galileo. Galileo makes these very interesting scientific discoveries and ends up being jailed by the church and disbanded from doing science. And Pope John Paul is, he's writing about this, and he's talking about, what can we learn from Galileo? What can we learn from this case? What does the church need to remember? And basically what he's saying is the church needs to remember they made a grave error. So he admits the church's error and says we need to think about this, because we can't just go off jailing people for doing scientific work just because we can't understand what they're saying. And he makes a really interesting point, because what he says is if there's something new that comes up from a scientific discovery, it's probably not bad science because science is vetted. It's probably bad theology. And we need to think back through our theology, and we need to make sure that the church fathers that we've included were doing good theology. And we need to make sure that our understanding of the text is solid, good, thoughtful theology. So he puts the responsibility back on the church. So he says that he also acknowledges, which is very important, that the church needs to be sensitive to the consequences of what it does. So he's saying, the church wields this incredible power, and we need to start being a little bit more thoughtful and sensitive about how we're doing it. we need to examine and become more inspired. We need to examine science and become more inspired to teach good theology. We need to learn from science and not discredit it, basically, but also not learn from it in a way that changes our belief, but in a way that makes us more thoughtful. We need to, if we're troubled by something, we need to go back to our theology and revisit what kind of, like, why that troubles us and how our faith should be understood correctly so that that's not so troubling. He says that the church should be not hasty, but also not hesitant. So when there's new science, the church doesn't need to jump at it, but also the church can't sit around dragging its feet. So he says both are incredibly harmful. And he says we need to remember that it's probably going to always be the mistake of the interpreter. So he holds up the notion of, the Word of God is more or less inerrant, but he says that the way we've been interpreting it can very often be wrong. And his kind of final notion is that we need to learn. We need to learn from what we've done. We need to learn from our history, and we need to learn from science. Also, I don't know if you guys picked... Pope Pius was who John Paul was citing, and also Pius was citing Gould. Gould cited Pius as well. So that is an important reading if you guys want to go back and find some of that. Very interesting. They keep all of the popes, in any pope's writings, in both Latin and many translated languages. So if you guys want to find that, it's a pretty quick search. But Pius made many of the same points, not quite to the same extreme as John Paul, but definitely was saying, hey, where all of a sudden this idea that science and religion are enemies, I'm unclear. So hopefully that should help you in this week's discussion. I think it's a pretty easy discussion. I think that it's going to be a discussion where you can obviously, use these 3 writings. Very, very helpful, very interesting, good thoughts come out of them, like our history of where we get our thoughts come out of them. But a lot of this week's discussion is going to be intuitive, and probably a lot of this week's discussion is going to involve things that we've all lived through. So, feel free to incorporate personal experience. Quick note on the Judaism reading. Thought it was really, really interesting. I think that if you guys, we kind of got into it in Islam, but you remember you've got the Abrahamic religions. Christianity comes from Judaism. Islam comes from Judaism. They're both considered reform religions of Judaism. Important points about Judaism. That's where we get the Hebrew Bible, which becomes the Old Testament, also becomes the Old Testament for Islam. And kind of where we get most of our understanding of Western history. When you say it's a Western religion, it's probably an Abrahamic religion. This is it's important because it's the bloodline of most modern faith. It's kind of where everything starts for Western religion. So I think you guys will find it interesting. Also, let me think if there was any major points that we want to take out of this. I think, monotheism, that's an important point. So when you're talking about the way the Jewish people understood the world, they understood the world as having lots of gods, but their God was sort of superior to all of them and possibly even created all of them, depending on which piece of literature you're using. So Judaism will always acknowledge that there are other gods, but it's where they only worship one God. So they come up with that sort of notion of monotheism. And you'll hear in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible about God kind of going to war with other gods and competing. And the God of the Hebrew Bible always wins. So you think, oh gosh, that's everything we've been working on has talked about how we can have a God that wins all the time and that always is the best, and that how is there evil in the world? Well, the God of the Hebrew Bible is not anywhere near as benevolent as the God of Christianity, and the God of the Hebrew Bible uses often other countries to punish his people. So the God of the Hebrew Bible has these characteristics that are jealous, angry, wrathful. Like, these things come up for the Jewish people. And when they are disobeying and when they forsake their God has no problem bringing in another country's army to take them over. And the Jewish people have a clear understanding that the reason that evil happens to them is as a form of punishment. And that's where, when you see groups like the Westboro Baptist Church, and they're talking about how God is using other countries as tools to punish America for homosexuality, these readings that they're using are coming out of this Jewish text. They're coming out of the Old Testament because it is there. It is there in the Old Testament. So that's an important piece to understand, is how that plays into what Christianity becomes, and how that is a very Jewish notion. It's also a Jewish notion that you can question God and you can appeal to God, and you can, maybe if you sing God's songs, that God, this is a religion of ancient people, and there is this notion that you can sort of make a plea on your own behalf or on someone's behalf to God, and that it will be answered, or maybe they will continue to be punished. It's hard to say. So those are the much more one-to-one interactions are from the Hebrew Bible. Also, the notion of punishment is from the Hebrew Bible. And I think the last very important point to keep in mind is how these texts maintained, and how that is the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew people had one of the first really solid written languages, and they very much valued keeping that language and keeping their cultural identity. And what happens is, when other countries, other people, other cultures took over the Jewish people that were all scholars. I mean, not scholars in the traditional sense, but they were all very, very literate. Many Jewish people were literate. It was a very important skill in their culture. So what they were able to do is, when they were taken over by another country, and that other country sent them to live here, or sent them to live here, basically what used to happen when countries in antiquity would take over one another, they would disperse the people. And so the Jews live in this exiled state, but since many of them are literate, they're able to take their books with them and their theology and their culture with them, and write it down and pass it down through generations despite being displaced. So what their major contribution is no other country, no other set of people usually could really do this. Once the other people were dispersed, that culture was more or less lost, because people couldn't maintain it living under other cultures, or living under other religions, or under other rule, or living in different areas without contact to one another. But the Jews were able to sort of maintain it through writing, and they kept the Psalms were songs that they wrote down so that people would remember their songs. The Proverbs were teachings that they wrote down that went through everywhere. And that was how the Jewish people were able to sort of maintain a culture, although they were living very far apart. And so when they do come back together, they worked on, this writing was important, this writing was important. So even after their temple was destroyed and they were sent out to live in many different places in the world, they were able to take their written texts with them. And because of that, many other countries respected them and allowed them to practice their religion. So Rome kind of sets the precedence for this. When Rome takes over, Rome is it's an empire at this point. It's taken over everywhere. And when Rome takes over a country, you become Roman and you worship Roman gods, and that's just how it is. But when Rome encounters the Jewish people and realizes that the Jewish people have texts that are older than Roman texts, and have traditions that are older than Roman traditions, they believe that the only fair and respectful thing they can do is allow the Jews to continue with their religion. And so they make that legal. So it's the only religion that's allowed to live under other religions. And so many other empires kind of take that as a rule of thumb and allow that to be how they operate with the Jewish people. And because of that, Judaism ends up living far, far, far longer than any of the other kind of, say, like indigenous religions of many of the areas. So that kind of gives you a good explanation of why we have Judaism as our oldest Western religion. So hopefully that helps, and you guys are all able to enjoy this reading. This was where I did a lot of my research, so if you guys have any questions on Judaism or Jewish writings, feel free to reach out. Throw them into a course help, throw them into an announcement, wherever would be helpful. But do try to sort of get ahead. The one nice thing about week 7 is we're going to get into Christianity, and none of you should... You'll find the readings interesting, but I don't think you'll find them like difficult to grapple with because you guys have some familiarity with the subject. So that is one thing that will help you going into these final weeks. So let me know if any of you need anything or if any of you need help or have questions. I'm always here for you, and hopefully you are ready to have a great week 6. All right, talk to you soon.